Welcome, everyone. It's lovely to have you join us this afternoon. I'd like to begin today's session by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that I am on, the Wurundjeri and Woiwurrung people, the Bunurong people of the East Kulin Nations. And in particular, I'd like to acknowledge Wurundjeri Elder Aunty Joy Murphy, who is a patron of Children's Ground. We'd also love to know the lands from where you're watching this webinar. So if you would like to share that in the comments, we would love to read it. My name is Megan Mundy. I work at Children's Ground in Naarm, Melbourne. I'm also a former high school teacher and teacher coach. This webinar is being hosted by Children's Ground, a First Nations organisation driving long-term change through First Nations culture and leadership, transforming education, health, well-being, employment and community life. It's breaking cycles of injustice and disadvantage with evidence, with equity and with opportunity. Every year, as part of National Reconciliation Week, Children's Ground asks schools and workplaces to wear it yellow to raise funds for Children's Ground. And in the lead up to National Reconciliation Week, which is an opportunity for non-First Nations people to learn about the history of this land, we'd like to take some time to explore different ways that teachers and educators can practice truth-telling and bringing First Nations perspectives into their classroom. So thank you for joining us. We have 5 wonderful educators here to share some of their experiences with you. During this discussion, you can ask questions through the Q&A function or make comments in the chat. And later we'll be asking some of your questions to the panel. We're going to start in Central Australia with Nikita. Nikita, you're an Aranda woman currently working at Children's Ground in Central Australia as an early years educator at Imborinkanarpip or Burt Creek. What does learning look like for you, Nikita?
Learning looks like for me is in my community is family coming together, teaching one another and learning from each other, teaching our young ones on country and young adults, being a role model to our next generation, learning outside on our grandfathers and grandmothers' country, teach them how to look for bush tuckets and soakage waters. I'm teaching early years kids from 0 to 5 years old.
Wow, that sounds like a really exciting place to learn with lots of outdoor activities on country with the little ones. Tilly, you're a Western trained primary teacher working alongside Nikita. What's different about Children's Ground compared to other primary school settings?
I'd probably say, the largest difference is that we get to go out on country for all the learning. So the children are working alongside their family and seeing a lot of the women and the men in their communities leading and standing strong in their culture.
Wow. So we're teaching a First Nations education system which sits outside of the Western system at Children's Ground, and we do this especially with primary school age children out of school hours and in collaboration with other schools in the area. Children's Ground, as a systems change organisation, is working with a national network of First Nations educators called Yuchera to advocate for a First Nations education system. And you can read more about that in the MK Turner report. And if there are any First Nations educators here, you can learn more about Yuchera in the link in the chat. Nikita and Tilly, why is it important for First Nations children to be able to learn on country immersed in their culture and their language?
Well, it is important for our children to learn our language because they are the next generation in line to carry our culture. It is our first language and we are the first teachers to teach our little ones. Teaching on country is the most important thing to do for our young ones, because if they're teaching our young ones in classrooms, they are not seeing the outside world where our ancestors have walked With their family, our kids are learning together while on country, also learning the kinship of how they are connected with the land and families.
Amazing. Thank you, Nikita. We're going to stick with the little ones for a little bit longer. Lauren, you're a kindergarten teacher in Coburg, Melbourne. Can you tell us what learning looks like for your children, and how do you use a seasonal calendar and nature play to bring First Nations perspectives into your teaching?
Yeah, hi, thank you. So we are in Coburg. We are very lucky at our centre to have access to a big outdoor space. So our program is all indoor outdoor, which just means that children have access to the outdoor space throughout the day, and we really try and use that a lot for their learning. We also do a bush kinder program where children from term 2 go out once, maybe twice a week, and get to spend time out in the local community. We try and choose sites that are in bushland along the local creek, and throughout the year we try and build our curriculum around what children notice in nature. But while we're doing that, we reference a seasonal calendar, and we try and integrate the Wurundjeri seasonal calendar so that we're really referencing First Nations understandings of what was happening on our local area, and then building that knowledge with our children.
Amazing. Lots of outdoor learning happening so far. And Katie, you're a pre-primary teacher in remote WA. Can you tell us about the community that you live in, but also your classroom and how you integrate First Nations language and culture in your context?
Sure. So I live in the Beagle Bay community. We're about an hour and 10 minutes north of Broome in Western Australia. Beagle Bay was a mission established in the late 1800s, and the school has been in existence since the early 1900s. Our classroom it's a small little classroom, and you go in and the first thing you have is a yarning mat, and then a kitchen area, a little play kitchen, a reading nook, their little sink. They've got a literacy and numeracy tables with interchangeable activities. They've got some small tables for collaboration and their activities. And then they've got a little construction area, which we change up around each term. Everything that really happens mostly happens on the mat, of course. So much learning and talking and yarning there. We follow the philosophy of two-way learning. So that's that educational philosophy of First Nations culture and knowledge alongside Western curricula and academics. We'll integrate the local language of the Nyul people into our yarning circle. So we do the Berry Street trauma model, and in our circle we'll do our acknowledgement of country, we'll do our good morning, we will do our how are you, I'm feeling, and then how are you feeling, all in local language. We'll bring that into songs like Heads and Shoulders, Knees and Toes with local language. We'll use it in everyday conversation. How many Murrabab are here? And of course, all of this is to revitalise the language. As we know, there were 250 about languages. There's only 150 left. So every chance we can with our Aboriginal teaching assistants, we bring it to life. We also use two pedagogies called translanguaging and conceptual play worlds. And that means we may do the Very Hungry Caterpillar with the children and do their literacy and numeracy learning through that. And then with the Aboriginal teacher assistants, we will and plan to create the Very Hungry Frog in local language. And we will find the days of the week and the children will draw it. And that's how they'll learn their language, and they'll use their numeracy and their literacy, and both of those things they get to take outside and act out and play. So they're doing the Western way and they're doing the First Nations way, which is just so important. In our house, the children will come and share stories about their the smoking ceremonies, their cultures, their traditions of when they were born, and share their stories, and they will then draw and write a sentence on that, And we'll also do two-way writing. So they'll draw a picture of what they did on the weekend. My Aboriginal teacher assistant will write it in it's called Aboriginal English still. We're obviously aware of First Nations, but Aboriginal English, and then I'll write the sentence in standard Australian English. We do two-way science with the rangers, and we also go on country with our First Nations educators. So everything we do goes hand in hand with culture. And I think, Megan, we were going to chat about how we would bring that into the Western way. Did you want me to cover that now, or do you want me to
So
wait?
you're obviously in a very specific community right now, but if you're going to come back to the East Coast or somewhere else more urban, how would you take what you're doing in that context and bring it into a more urban context?
Absolutely. Yes. So first of all, I'd work out what land I'm on. And then I would also find out who in my school is First Nations, talk to them, what are their stories, what did they know about their families, what did they know about their kinship system, what do they know, bring them into the classroom to share with the students. And so much can come out of that, as we know as educators, drawing, writing, all sorts. I'd then probably go to the local community. For example, I looked up Geelong. So with their local country, they've got a community down there of First Nations, and I'd go and talk to them and I'd say, I'm a year one teacher and this is what my children are learning and teaching, learning about. Have you got someone who can come and tell us what they learnt, what they did at school? And it's again, just sharing knowledge and connecting people to each other. So that's how I'd approach it, two-pronged.
Fabulous. Thank you, Katie. And on to Paige. You're a humanities teacher at a high school in Mildura. You've developed a new unit on deep time for your Year 7 students. Can you tell us about the subject and how your students' perceptions have changed during their time?
Yeah, of course. So, for a little bit of context, I'm a pre-service teacher, so I'm in my second year of my master's. And in my first year, if anyone has ever been can recall what it was like in their first year, it's a whole lot of trying to learn content knowledge whilst also, working out how you're going to teach it. And so, originally last year when I'd started, we had a very short unit on teaching on ancient Australia for Year 7s. And it just wasn't deep enough to be able to kind of challenge sometimes the misconceptions that naturally kind of walk in with the students when they enter the classroom. And it was, for me, something that I really wanted to approach this year in a different way through a strengths-based sort of design. So luckily, we had a really supportive humanities team, and we changed the whole way that we did it so that we could find space to put 12 weeks on deep time, which has been a recent addition in the Victorian Curriculum 2.0. And this unit, for me, my key approaches was centering Indigenous knowledge systems and ways of knowing, and the idea that this was going to be the foundational way that we would learn about deep time, with then bringing in Western archaeology or Western ways of thinking that are also in the curriculum, but centering first Indigenous knowledges where we could. And so the key approaches that I used there were inquiry-based learning. So having students kind of investigate questions and construct understandings on what they, were interested in researching. So, for example, when we did a megafauna task and students were really interested in the different types of megafauna that used to roam the earth, I was lucky enough to have some access to some oral traditions that were shared for educational purposes. And so we looked at those first, and that became the initial framework with which students understood that megafauna were, existing in Australia for a really long time, and that it was actually Western evidence that had to catch up by finding fossils to prove what oral traditions already were teaching. So it was kind of a way to position again, Indigenous knowledge as as such a legitimate and important source of evidence for understanding, and almost as if, through archaeology or geology, we're sort of catching up with what's already been known and talked about for so long. So yeah, that was, I guess, one of the key approaches there. Another thing, going back to some of the misconceptions that, were sort of in the room, I also had an Indigenous Australian student in the class, and I really was aware of the fact that cultural safety and our responsibilities under the AITSL standards include, making sure not only are we supporting our Indigenous students, our First Nations students, but generally we have an obligation to create a really culturally safe environment. And the Murrung strategy provides, in Victoria at least, a little bit more of a guide here, in that it's important that we're not just respecting and including Indigenous knowledges, but we're explicitly valuing them. So to sort of create that reconciliatory environment, that became my initial priority before we even began teaching. So before I started content, how are we showing to each other in the classroom that we respect each other, that we respect each other's cultures, that we know what's right and what's kind, and that's what the sort of behaviour that we're going to channel. Versus not. So really building in things like discussion protocols, brain breaks that were secretly actually used to get them to be more collaborative with each other and kinder and respectful. I think they thought they were fun, but secretly I'm getting them to, work together as a team, be kind to each other. They seem like really simple skills, but I think for a reconciliatory environment and from a cultural safety risk perspective, they became really foundational for students having the open mind to, if they respect each other, why would they say something that might be misconstrued or taken in a way that, could be viewed as quite disrespectful? And with that in mind, I started to see a shift. So at the end of our unit, we had to design a timeline where we chronologized different sources, and students were just, without even prompting, they had options to pick any sort of sources to explain deep time. And they started to pick a lot of oral traditions and Indigenous knowledge stories, instead of necessarily just going to fossils. And I think this is actively showing that they're valuing Indigenous knowledges. They're seeing them as a legitimate gateway to then understanding so much about, deep time and the 65,000 years of First Nations history.
And what was that strategy that you mentioned in Victoria, Paige? Is it just for secondary, or is it for primary and secondary?
So I believe it's for primary and secondary. It's the Murrung plan, and it's the Department of Education and Training for Victoria. They released that plan, I believe, I think it was 2019. Oh, gosh, I could double check that and can look for you, but yes.
We can share a link afterwards via email. Well, we've looked at lots of different ways to celebrate First Nations perspectives, from learning on country in Central Australia and WA, and outdoor play in Melbourne, and then this deep time unit in Mildura. But National Reconciliation Week is a time to focus on the impacts of colonisation in this country. Paige, we'll stick with you. You've also developed a new elective subject for Year 10s, focusing on the Frontier Wars. How did you help students develop empathy during their learning? And can you tell us a bit about the subject?
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess for context, Year 10 is a kind of a unit, an optional unit at our school. So they've already kind of studied a lot of the wars, and I thought it was a really good opportunity, now that the Frontier Wars is, really front and centre in the new BCAA 2.0 curriculum, to be able to teach this foundational part of our collective history. And so the unit kind of focused on, all the way from initial invasion to how First Nations peoples were resisting across multiple frontiers. And the key priority for me, again, was addressing misconceptions. And this all started all the way from, the idea that sovereignty was legally gained. For background, I used to be my background was law. And so I was quite passionate about making it really clear about terra nullius and the fallacy that was there, and that this wasn't empty land, and it was something that then eventually was legally and historically challenged and later overturned. But teaching the foundation that, sovereignty was never ceded, reframed this whole period of time in Australia as invasion and resistance. And in order to build empathy and foster that within my students, I try to utilise decolonising pedagogy, which focuses on re-centering teaching again through an Indigenous lens rather than a purely Eurocentric lens, which is typically, I think by the time you get to Year 9, 10 history, tends to be how we would approach things. And so I do this, for example, through creating ethical dilemma tasks where students might research a frontier warrior and decide, well, what would they do within their position? You know, they're in these really complex positions where they have to decide, you know, as a resistance warrior, how, you know, do we fight? Do we negotiate? How can we resist this invasion that is not welcome? And what are the complexities of that? So helping students engage with that perspective, especially through primary sources where we can, again, was a really good way to foster empathy in that sense.
Great. Wow. Your second year of teaching, you've made a lot of amazing projects in your time. Very amazing. Katie, you're teaching in a First Nations context. Why is it important to teach your little people and all young people about things like the stolen generation and other parts of colonisation? How does that learning look like in your context?
Well, in our context, I live and work amongst the stolen generation. So there's three reasons why it's so important. One is it's our responsibility as educators to speak to it as honestly and openly. Two, if they don't get to share their knowledge and their stories, our locals, then it will die, that will die with them. And three, it's for healing. So I have a little picture, I think, that I shared earlier, if we can pop up there. A little 5-year-old came to my class. She was drawing. I said, "Oh, darling, what are you drawing there?" She said, "Oh, that's the nuns looking after the stolen children." And she said it beautifully, matter-of-factly, and she was proud as punch. We worked really hard to make sure they had 2 shoes on each. And there were the little babies, and she went and showed everybody and got some stickers, and there was a lot of pride in that. Thank you so much. But basically, my children here already come to school with so much knowledge. They know about their just disjointed families, the traditions. They know about the stolen generation and other things that have happened. So we bring that into every area of learning into our classroom. We will speak about it in a very honest way. And the way that we'll do it is in my early years class is, how do you feel about that? First of all, what do you know? How do you feel about that? And it's my job and my First Nations educator. We both say that was wrong. It was wrong they did that. And part of my role here is whenever we make mistakes, we right our wrongs. Part of my role here as one educator is to show that I don't act in that way and that I respect them, I respect their families, I respect their culture, and I respect their knowledge. That goes so far in our community. Really, really far. The First Nations people here as well have their own beliefs. So they will have religious beliefs alongside their spiritual beliefs. And both of those belief systems will give them strength and courage through these difficult times. So it enables us, when we talk with the children, what do you believe in? How do you believe, and to stay strong how do you think they stayed strong during those times? The amount of knowledge and the amount of discussion and the amount of healing that can come out of that subject honestly and openly is immeasurable. And as I mentioned earlier, our elders here, our families, they have so much knowledge, they have so much history, they have so many stories to tell. If we aren't talking about them, if we aren't respecting them, if we aren't sharing them, if the children aren't talking about them, they die with them. And that's a responsibility that I hold with great integrity to bring forward. So that's why we do it here.
Wow, thank you, Katie, for sharing that.
Thank you.
Lauren, your Children's Centre has participated in Wear It Yellow for a number of years. How has Wear It Yellow helped introduce themes of reconciliation, and how do you do that in an age-appropriate way?
Yeah, well, I mean, so much of what Katie was just talking about is just we're also in the early years, so but obviously we don't have that immediacy that Katie does to community that have been so affected by that. But I think it is really important to introduce those themes and recognise that that has happened, especially on an important week like Reconciliation Week. But some families may not have introduced those themes at home, and some families might even be quite confronted about what that conversation looks like. But I do think I agree with Katie, like you just have to be ready to have that conversation and talk about it in a strength-based way. Like, well, if someone is hurt, what does reconciliation, what does sorry look like, and what does it feel like? So something like Wear It Yellow has been an amazing opportunity for us to engage in things like fundraising. We had lovely families who introduced a Play-Doh fundraising drive, which we are continuing on with. And it just means that it's a way that we can say, here's something that has happened and here's what we can do about it. Here's an action that we can take, which is really, I think it's really important to empower young children to do that.
Fabulous. Nikita, as a First Nations educator, what are some ways that non-First Nations people can help reconcile the effects of colonisation in places of education? How can we help in this space?
Well, schools can employ more First Nation people in mainstream and train more First Nation people to become a teacher. Engage more First Nation people in planning. Also teaching alongside us and support us to teach and communicate. Also asking questions and trying to connect with each other.
So it sounds like a lot of relationship building and communication and asking lots of questions and making space for that to happen. Thank you. And Tilly, as a non-First Nations educator in a First Nations context, why is it important for you to be aware of the history of colonisation in this country?
I feel it's important to know the true history. You need to know the truth about colonization in order to then be able to start to decolonize your mind and the ways that you move through the world and this country. Because that I suppose then helps me to understand how the trauma from colonization has impacted the people that I work with, and it helps me to then be able to take time in learning how to build relationships with the children and the families, how to build trust from understandably so much distrust that First Nations people may have. Just really being aware of that and also just generally being aware of not taking up the space that the Western system has taken up and really supporting First Nations folk here and my colleagues to lead from the front and stand strong in their culture and language. Yep.
Beautiful. Thank you, Tilly.
Thank you.
Lauren and Paige, in a few minutes we'll be opening up to questions from the audience, so feel free to keep popping those in the chat or in the Q&A function. But Lauren and Paige, if you were chatting to a teacher who really didn't know where to start, what advice would you give them and what resources would you suggest? We'll start with you, Lauren.
Yeah, well, I feel like Katie touched on it earlier as well. Find your local group, find the country that you're on, find out what like you want to make as much space for community voices, like the First Nation voices, as you can, but we also need to recognize how busy they are, and to make sure we're backing them to be heard, to have the space and have the resources to be heard. So of course, for us, there are things like Wurundjeri cultural groups that we can be in contact with, and you can employ them to do education at your centre, or you can do PDs with them. But then if there are things like that don't work, there are groups like the Early Childhood Outdoor Learning Network, and they do a really great job of making sure that they're consistently employing and centering First Nations perspectives. So by, say, going to their workshops, that they're centralising those voices as well, and training and supporting those communities. I mean, we've been really lucky to just be in contact with the local rangers who have done a lot of ecology and restoration. So if you can bump into people like that and ask questions, sometimes they're a great resource. Other things, there are, in Victoria, we actually have a learning framework, the Possum Skin Pedagogy, which is specifically designed for this area, and protocols for teaching First Nations perspectives. So that's a really important one to reference, but different areas will have different protocols. So again, just do your research and find out what country you're on, and how you can connect to that community, and then really reference and centralise their voices.
Lovely. Thank you, Lauren. What about you, Paige?
Yeah, echo what Katie and Lauren have said. I think that that's probably the most important advice, and something that, as a second year teacher, I'm still working towards. I think something that I definitely want to be doing more of next year. I think it's an ongoing thing as a teacher to try and be able to work out where to start. And I think sometimes it can feel really confronting, particularly when as been pointed out, as a non-Indigenous person, I'm not a dispenser of Indigenous culture. That's not my role. And I think it's really important to make that distinction as a means to be easier on yourself, to know that somewhere to start is better than nothing. That you can, as a teacher, platform Indigenous perspectives. You have the power to platform Indigenous perspectives, ways of knowing within the discipline which you're teaching. And you can even caveat that to the students too, that, you're not here to speak for Indigenous culture or Indigenous peoples, but it is, I think, our job as educators to facilitate that relationship and bring those voices into the classroom. So I would say definitely whatever you're doing is already a good start. And then thinking about it as an ongoing journey where you're going to continually work with it. I personally have got a lot to build into how I'm teaching myself. So I think I think there's just some strength in starting. The other thing I would just add to that is, when it came to kind of also getting my content knowledge up to date, and that sort of thing, to joining professional communities when you can, through professional communities like, History Teachers Association Victoria being one of them. I found out that I actually had someone who lectured there that I could connect with, and she was able to give me advice, and she was able to give me some ways of bringing further Indigenous knowledge into the classroom that she had experienced from working with local communities. So there's all these ways that once you start asking and you start bringing those connections in, I was able to then bring them directly into my classroom too. And it kind of just starts from there. The ball starts rolling. So I really highly recommend doing something like that also.
And Lauren mentioned briefly about how to work respectfully with First Nations groups, and knowing how busy they are and how many people call on them with questions. Paige, do you have any further advice about how to work respectfully with local First Nations groups?
Well, this is when I did defer to my university professors and looped in with them, because it's something that we've talked about in that context, but something that I'm, again, a goal for me for next year. But yeah, next goal, I would defer to the protocols for Koori education when it comes to primary or at least secondary school teaching. So this is for Victoria, so I'm sure there might be some equivalent protocols in other states and territories. But essentially, this kind of just emphasises how to go about building a respectful partnership with local Aboriginal education consultative groups. And those protocols include really key principles like not expecting, I guess, not dictating what you're asking from communities. That's really important. It's up to communities to decide what, how much, and how they share. What you want to be doing is making sure you're following the appropriate processes, including, really important things like how can you make sure that when you're inviting them into a school or community that they can have the respect and care that they need, organising, what that's going to look like, what sort of space needs to be created, how can we facilitate access, how can we facilitate reimbursement, those sorts of things.
I've got some great comments in the chat as well about how to work respectively and some different organisations to connect with. So thank you for contributing those ideas. Katie, could you tell us about what impact you've seen on your students when talking about these concepts?
Absolutely. I was also going to add on to what Paige just said as well. It's very much about us listening to the First Nations groups in the first instance before we sort of come at them with any requests. It's such about respect and having that time to listen to them speaking before we share what we need from them, and then the relationship builds and you can come together. I've found in my experience. In the classroom where we've integrated language learning and we've integrated the culture, the parents show they beam with pride. They're very much aware that the languages are, and it's been described as going to sleep. So when they come and they see the word wall with the language words on there, or the counting that the children are doing, or the games they've played that we've recorded on Seesaw, like all of us do, but speaking in language, they feel respected, they feel proud, and they feel hope. And that's a real privilege to be a part of facilitating. Yes. And we've also got our First Nation educators up here are also being trained teachers, and they teach our culture classes and our language classes. And I didn't get to say that, so I want to make sure that everyone knew that as well.
Amazing. We've touched on this topic a little bit already, but if one of you would like to contribute to this question, what do you need to be aware of as an educator when exploring this content with young people? Paige, I know that you mentioned having a First Nation student in your Year 10 class when looking at the Australian laws. Like, what did you need to be aware of in that situation?
So the first thing that I did was I reached out to more experienced teachers, and the advice that I received was making sure that you're, providing agency for that Indigenous student to decide to what extent they want to engage, if they want to engage, and providing avenues also if they don't want to engage. So I kind of had pulled this Indigenous student aside, very discreetly before at a different time, and just we spoke about sort of the histories that we were going to look at, whether he was comfortable, if you ever felt like he wanted to leave the room, if you ever wanted to go to the library and do something else. If you did want to stay in the room, he doesn't necessarily have to get through the work or anything. It was more about that flexibility and him being able to choose how much he wanted to participate and engage. That was kind of the approach that we took. I think it is really important not to place, I suppose, or be really conscious that when you bring these sorts of, especially Frontier Wars, it's extremely traumatic, and live history, and you being aware of that is really, really important. Whilst it's so important, I think, to teach, and it needs to be in the curriculum, I think it's also just really important to be wary that this isn't just, a detached or disassociated overseas history. This is very real, and facilitating that conversation is really, really important.
Fabulous. Thank you. Does anyone want to add to that question?
I will always defer to the First Nations educator in the room when we bring up these conversations. And before we even do it, I'll have had a quick chat with her. This is what we're going to cover. If it hasn't been an ad hoc thing like that beautiful drawing, which angle should I go down? Would you like to start this? Let me know how you see it going forward. And we collaborate on that. Yeah. So to make sure that it's covered off sensitively.
Fabulous. What are some of the challenges that may arise from exploring this content with young people? We've spoken about the experience of having First Nations people in the room and having to be careful about the way we present this information, but has anyone experienced pushback or discomfort or defensiveness from parents when engaging in this content in their school setting?
We definitely have had some conversations where people have questioned, that area of the curriculum. I think, again, just informing yourself and being ready to have those challenging conversations and back yourself and say, this is actually important. And for children to recognize that they can still be empowered in the face of, a deep harm that has been done, and that we can take action to make things better. I think that's actually a really powerful thing to teach children. And if you can just say that to parents and try and explain the importance of that and be able to back your own perspective on that, and because it is important, and speak to it, then I think you don't have to be agreed with, but if you can speak to it in an informed way, people there's only so much pushback you're going to get as long as you're doing it respectfully.
And on the topic of being respectful, how can we ensure that experiences that we discuss during Reconciliation Week come with genuine respect and learning, rather than just being, oh, it's Reconciliation Week, we better talk about this? How do we do it in a really genuine way that builds on this information? Who would like to answer?
I think it's about having empathy, and I think it's about a real, genuine, intrinsic drive for healing, for truth, for building those relationships and reconciliation. Yes, so I think it's really an internal drive to bond and heal.
Amazing.
Absolutely.
What about you, Nikita and Tilly? What do you think?
Yeah, we've just been thinking about the idea of, I suppose, really going all the way back, which reminded us of, at the start of each year here at Children's Ground, we do a really big truth-telling session, and we get the big butcher's paper out, and we do a really long number blind, and we move through the entire history, both sides. So what what a lot of people got taught in school, which is not the full truth, and what's generally known, and then we do the other side is the whole truth, which it's a really heavy session, but it's really important. And I think if you want to be authentic, that's a really excellent place to start, is by really looking deeply into Google, and if you can, any First Nations folk that are open and comfortable to share their stories, or just sort of be there to support and fact check. But that's a great place to start for Reconciliation Week, I think. If you could get as many people in your school or workplace involved, that can be really powerful. to start that journey.
Fabulous. Thank you. We have another question which I'll throw to Katie and Lauren. Are there any, and Nikita and Tilly, are there any books that we can read for an early childhood age group?
There's fantastic books from a place called Magabala Books, which I've given to Megan that'll be sent out in the resource. So they're fantastic. And the Indigenous Literacy Foundation have got fantastic books as well. They're sent to schools, but if you look on those sites and see them all, I think it's Auntie Faye or Auntie Joy Murphy. She's got fantastic children's books, but Magabala is fantastic. And if there's any more, I'll send them through to Megan and she can circulate those.
Amazing. And Nikita, what books do we use at Children's Grant?
Well, we have these books that my aunties make from Children's Grant. We use them books to make a puppet out of it for our early years, and one of my cousins just did a painting of a book called Ilongara, Iwanangwalam Araram. It means what comes out at night. And these other books is like Pmawana, what snake, and one of my little favorite books that I like to read to my little ones, especially on session when they have nap time. It's Tagara Cook Angatagua. It's a thirsty little mouse. So yeah, we make a resource out of them books to take out to country and to come up with puppets and stories, and I can read that book without the book itself on my hand.
You know it so well. That's amazing. Lauren, are there any books that you use with your little people in your room?
Yeah, I mean, for Reconciliation Week, there is Sorry, or I think it's Somebody's Land. That they're a good starting point. But throughout the year, I think, we always try to choose as many First Nations authors. I mean, we're really lucky that we are on Wurundjeri country, and so then Auntie Joy does those beautiful stories like Welcome to Country. I also want to second Katie's shout out to Auntie Faye Muir. I love the Respect and the Sharing books. They're great. But yeah, I think also if you go to places like Koori Curriculum, they might have some good recommendations as well for some great books. But yeah.
And if I can just jump back in there. Sorry, Megan, I just remembered the Rainbow Serpent is a fantastic place to start. Tiddalik the Frog is fantastic. So much learning, so much art and craft, so many things can come out of those two as well.
We've just got time for one final question before we wrap things up. And I'd like to ask a few of you, what have the children taught you through this work that the adults or the education systems might have overlooked? What surprised you? What have the children taught you in this process?
I can have a go at starting that if you like, Megan. I finished up that Year 7 Deep Time unit, and Deep Time in a way, it's still such a new, sadly, it's still such a new addition to the curriculum. But I had some students kind of write a piece on why it's important that they learn about Deep Time. And in their discussion of this piece, they mentioned, Australia is described as such a young country, but actually we're not a young country. We're very, 65,000 years old. There's so much history, and just the appreciation of that dissonance how easy it was for them to put that together without any prompting for me, just from purely learning about deep time history and learning about the history of the past. It's not that complicated in the minds when you are truth telling and you are providing Indigenous and platforming Indigenous knowledges. It's not that complicated for students to put it together, and it's really rewarding to be able to see that play out in the way that they express themselves.
Amazing, thank you. What else have the students taught you?
Well, my students up here in the Dampier Peninsula, they certainly taught this city lady what we need when we go on country to go fishing. They'll be the first ones to tell me, the 4 and 5-year-olds. They'll tell me how to catch turtle. They'll tell me how to catch dugong. They'll tell me what all the different fish that we got up here. They'll show me how they cook them, obviously in play. And they have taught me about resilience, and they've taught me about pride, and they've taught me about strength.
That's beautiful. Thanks, Katie. Anyone else with some final comments?
Yeah, I feel like the children I work with teach me a lot, especially about their culture, which reminds me that they are learning at every point that we're with them, and that's why this work is so important, especially when they are learning from their families. And that, they just have so much knowledge, as we know, but that they know what they want and what they need. And I think that, they are a voice that we always need to centre as well. Not always thinking that the adults know best, and to really, again, give them that space to share what they need as young people and what they want to learn in their culture, and how we can then bring that into our schools and into our teaching environments. So always trying to provide opportunities for the kids to speak up about their needs and wants, especially cultural ones.
Amazing. Well, thank you, everyone. I'd like to thank all of our incredible panelists for sharing your wisdom with us. But also thank you to our audience for giving us your time and your attention. We'll certainly be sending out an email with lots of the resources that we have mentioned today. So you don't need to quickly write them all down. They should come out in the next day or two. There's still plenty of time to sign up for Wear It Yellow. So if you'd like to get your school or early childhood centre involved, please visit Wear It Yellow and sign up. And we wish you well for the coming National Reconciliation Week. Thank you again, everyone. Have a lovely evening.